Hello, my dear adventurers, it's Fox. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures. Tonight, I'll be talking about some of the famous and most foundational ancient Greek myths and legends. It's been a while since I've done any mythology stuff, and I've gotten so many requests for it. It's funny, I've always wondered how the ancient civilizations could come up with far-fetched fantasies like these. But I suppose it makes total sense when you realize that they had to find a way to rationalize nearly every single thing in their daily lives. And a lot of these tales are still relevant and applicable in some way even today. I guess the ancient Greek gods were among the first to have daddy issues, before that became a thing as we know it. Also, small disclaimer, but some of these names really threw me for a loop, so please excuse any badly pronounced ones. And if you like what I do here and want a way to support the channel, then consider checking out my Patreon link down in the description. But anyways, for now all you've got to do is curl up, get cozy, and let's begin. The first thing we'll be talking about is the ancient Greek theogony and the clash of the Titans. Before time had meaning, before the first breath of wind crossed an empty void, there existed only chaos. It was a yawning, formless abyss where nothing could take shape or substance. This primordial state held no order, no structure, no distinction between up and down, light and shadow. From this incomprehensible void, the first elements of existence slowly emerged. Gaia, the earth, came into being without parent or creator, rising from chaos as the foundation of all that would follow. She was the very principle of stability and generation. Her body formed the mountains that would pierce the sky, the valleys that would cradle rivers, and the deep places where mysteries would hide. From her own substance, Gaia created Pontus, the primeval sea whose waters surrounded her lands. Then came her greatest creation, Uranus, the starry sky, who spread himself above her, matching her in breadth and scope. He covered her completely, becoming both her mate and her opposite. Where she was solid and nurturing, he was vast and distant. The union of earth and sky produced the first generation of divine beings. Gaia bore the Titans, 12 powerful children who embodied fundamental forces of the cosmos. Among them were Oceanus, the great river encircling the world, Hyperion, who would father the sun, Theia, the divine light, Mnemosyne, the living memory, and Cronus, whose name meant time, and who possessed a cunning mind beneath his tremendous strength. These titans were beings of immense power, neither fully mortal nor quite like the gods who would come after them. They basically represented the raw, untamed forces of a young universe still finding its shape. Uranus looked at his children and felt threatened. Maybe he recognized they had the same kind of power that brought him into existence. Or maybe he just couldn't stand sharing the universe with anyone else. Whatever his reasoning, he did something monstrous. Every time one of the Titans was born, he grabbed them and shoved them back into Gaia's body, trapping them in deep caverns inside the earth. Gaia was in agony, stretched out and suffering with all her children imprisoned inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. Gaia loved her children and wanted them free, but she wasn't strong enough to fight Uranus on her own. So she made a plan. She crafted a massive sickle from adamant, a metal harder and sharper than anything that would ever exist again. Then she called out to her imprisoned children, asking which of them had the guts to stand up to their father. Most of them were too scared, but Cronus volunteered. He was willing to be the weapon his mother needed. The next time Uranus came to be with Gaia, spreading himself across her like he always did, Cronus sprang out from hiding. With the adamant sickle, he castrated his father, cutting away the connection between earth and sky. Blood spilled from the wound, and where it hit the ground, new beings were born. The Furies, who would spend eternity punishing family crimes, and the Giants, who would cause their own problems later. The severed flesh fell into the sea, and the waters churned and foamed. From that foam, Aphrodite would eventually emerge. Uranus pulled away, diminished and furious. As he retreated from the earth, he cursed Cronus with a prophecy. One day, Cronus's own children would overthrow him, just like he'd overthrown his father. That curse would eat at Cronus for his entire reign. With Uranus gone, Cronus became the new ruler. The Titans took over, and this period became known as the Golden Age. Cronus married his sister Rhea, following the example set by their parents. Rhea was nurturing and maternal, basically the opposite of Cronus in temperament. She gave birth to 6 children, 3 daughters, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, and 3 sons, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. But Uranus's prophecy haunted Cronus. He'd violently overthrown his own father, so why would his kids treat him any differently? His solution was no less brutal than his dad's. As each baby was born, he swallowed it whole. The children weren't dead, really, but they weren't exactly alive either. Just sort of stuck in the darkness of their father's stomach. Rhea had to watch this happen 5 times. When she got pregnant with her 6th child, she couldn't do it again. She went to Gaia for help, and together they came up with a trick. Rhea traveled to a cave on Mount Ida in Crete and gave birth there in secret. The baby was a boy, and she named him Zeus. She left him with nymphs who lived in the cave, then wrapped a large stone in baby blankets and brought it to Cronus. He was so paranoid and rushed that he swallowed the stone without even looking, thinking he'd consumed another child. On Crete, Zeus grew up under the protection of the nymphs. They fed him milk from a goat named Amalthea. A group of warriors, called the Curettes, would bang their shields and spears together whenever baby Zeus cried, covering up the noise so Cronus wouldn't hear and learn of the deception. Bees from the mountain brought him honey. He grew quickly, the way gods do, and as he matured, he learned who he really was and what had happened to his siblings. When Zeus became an adult, he knew it was time to make things right. With help from Metis, an ocean nymph known for her intelligence, he prepared a strong drink, wine mixed with mustard, that would make Cronus throw up everything he'd swallowed. Zeus got his father to drink it through some trickery and disguising himself as a cupbearer. Cronus vomited violently. Out came everything in his stomach, starting with the stone he'd swallowed last. Zeus would later set that stone up at Delphi as a monument. Then came his siblings, in reverse order: Poseidon, Hades, and the 3 goddesses. Since they were immortal, they hadn't died inside Cronus. Instead, they'd grown to full adulthood in there. They came out ready to fight. That's how the war began. The Titanomachy, the battle between the Titans and the younger gods who would become the Olympians. Zeus freed the Cyclopes from Tartarus, where Cronus had locked them away, and they repaid him by making weapons: thunderbolts for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, and a helmet that made the wearer invisible for Hades. Zeus also released the Hecatonchires, giants with 100 hands each, who became powerful allies. The fighting lasted 10 years. The earth shook constantly, and mountains were ripped from the ground. The seas boiled from the heat of Zeus's lightning. The Titans fought from Mount Othrys, while the gods defended Mount Olympus. Most Titans sided with Cronus, though not all of them. Oceanus stayed neutral, and Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, joined Zeus's side. Maybe he could see how things would end. Eventually, the gods won. They wrapped the defeated Titans in unbreakable chains made by the Cyclopes and threw them into Tartarus, a prison as far below the earth as the sky is above it. Bronze walls and iron gates surrounded it. The 100-handed giants stood guard to make sure the Titans stayed put forever. Atlas, who'd led the Titan armies, got special treatment. Zeus condemned him to hold up the sky for eternity, bearing that weight on his shoulders. But the fighting wasn't over. Gaia was pretty ticked off that her Titan children had been imprisoned. She somehow mated with Tartarus, the endless pit, and produced a new generation of giants, massive and terrifying warriors built for battle. The Gigantomachy started, a second huge war between the old powers and the new order. The giants were incredibly tough opponents. According to an oracle, the gods couldn't kill them without help from a mortal. So Heracles ended up fighting alongside the Olympians. Just a quick side note here in case you're confused about the mention of Heracles, like I was when I initially learned about this. So, the thing about Greek mythology is that there's basically no chronology that actually makes sense. So yes, the Heracles who killed the giants also did the labors, even though that doesn't make chronological sense. Just sort of roll with it. But back to the story. This war was even more brutal than the first one. The giant Alcyoneus couldn't be killed while he was in his homeland, so Heracles had to drag him past the border before finishing him off. Porphyrion, the strongest giant, took hits from both Zeus's thunderbolt and Heracles' arrow before he went down. One by one, the giants fell until Gaia finally stopped sending challengers. With both wars won, Zeus and his brothers divided up the universe. Zeus took the sky and became king of both gods and humans. Poseidon got the seas and everything in them. Hades took the underworld, ruling over the dead and all the wealth hidden underground. They shared the earth and Mount Olympus. The Olympian system was in place, and a new era started, one where gods would meddle in human affairs, create heroes, destroy kingdoms, and shape the world according to their whims. Uranus's prophecy had come true. The cycle of sons overthrowing fathers was done, and Zeus's rule would last forever. Okay, so the next myth is about the three sisters of fate. Pretty much all the big mythologies, like Norse, for example, have a version of this, which I think is a big reason I find this myth so captivating. In Greek mythology, the Moirae are the three goddesses of fate. They're also just collectively called the Fates. They stand apart from every other force in the Greek cosmos. These three sisters, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, controlled something that even Zeus himself couldn't touch: fate. They weren't like the other gods who could be bargained with, tricked, or swayed by prayers and sacrifices and stuff like that. The Moirae were, for lack of a better word, absolute. What they decided was final, and nobody, mortal or immortal, had any power to change their judgment. Different stories gave them different origins. Some said they were daughters of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, born from darkness itself without a father. This made sense in a way. Fate existed before the Olympians, before the Titans, maybe even before anything else. Other accounts claimed Zeus fathered them with Themis, the goddess of divine law and order, which would explain why their decrees carried such weight, and why even the king of gods had to respect their authority. A few sources listed Ananke, the personification of inevitability and compulsion, as their mother. Whoever their parents were, the Moirae operated on a level beyond normal divine hierarchy. The sisters worked together with a single purpose, but each had her own role in the process. They were usually described as old women, though some traditions painted Clotho as young, since she dealt with birth and beginnings. They sat together at their workspace, surrounded by thread and the tools of their trade, weaving the tapestries of existence. Clotho was the spinner, the youngest of the three. Her name came from the Greek word for to spin, and that's exactly what she did. She held a spindle and from it drew out the thread of life. The moment a person was born or even conceived, according to some versions, Clotho began spinning their thread. Each strand represented an entire human life, and Clotho created it from raw potential, from the possibility of existence. The quality of the thread varied. Some she spun thick and strong, others thin and fragile. Some gleamed with gold or silver, meaning that they'd probably have lives of prosperity and honor. Others came out coarse and dark. People had no say in what kind of thread Clotho spun for them. She was the origin point, the creator, and her work began the whole process. Lachesis, the middle sister, was the allotter. Her name derived from lagchano, a Greek word meaning to receive by lot or to obtain through chance. She measured out the thread that Clotho spun, using her rod to determine how long each strand would be and what it would contain. This is where a person's destiny took shape. Lachesis decided the length of a life, whether someone would die in infancy or live to old age. But obviously, she did more than just measure length. She wove in the events, the turning points, the moments of joy and suffering that would define that existence. Would this person become a hero or a farmer? Would they know love or die alone? Would they achieve great things or live in obscurity? The interesting thing about Lachesis was what her name implied. The idea of obtaining something from lots suggested an element of randomness, like drawing straws or casting dice. Out of infinite possibilities, one fate got selected for each person. This raised questions that ancient Greeks debated constantly. Was fate truly random? Did the Moirae choose consciously, or did they simply reveal what had to be? Either way, once Lachesis measured out a thread and determined its contents, that was it. The course was set. So I guess if you aren't happy with how life is going, you could always blame her. Then came Atropos, whose name meant she who cannot be turned, or the inevitable. She was the cutter, and she carried shears that could slice through any thread, no matter how thick or divinely blessed. Atropos decided when and how each life would end. She might cut a thread short, ending an infant's life before it really began. She might let it run long, giving someone a full span of years. The manner of death was hers to determine too, whether peaceful or violent, sudden or drawn out, honorable or shameful. Atropos was often depicted as the oldest and most terrible of the three. Death was her domain, and she approached her work with absolute indifference. It didn't matter if you were a king or a beggar. When Atropos decided your thread had run its course, she cut it, and you died. Even the gods couldn't save someone whose thread Atropos had marked for cutting. The power of the Moirae showed itself in countless myths. When Meleager was born, the Fates appeared to his mother, Althea, and told her that the baby would live only as long as a particular log in the fireplace remained unburned. Althea snatched the log from the fire and kept it safe for years. Meleager grew into a great hero. But when he killed his mother's brothers in a dispute, she became so enraged that she threw the log back into the flames. As it burned, Meleager died in agony, exactly as the Moirae had decreed. Even Zeus had to respect their power. When he fell in love with the mortal woman, Alcmene, and bed her through trickery, she became pregnant with Heracles. Zeus boasted that the next child born in the line of Perseus would rule over all others. Hera, jealous as always, convinced the Moirae to delay Alcmene's labor while speeding up the birth of another child in that bloodline. As a result, Eurystheus was born first and became the king, while Heracles, despite being Zeus's son and the greatest hero who ever lived, had to serve Eurystheus and complete the 12 labors. Zeus had made the decree, but the fates controlled the timing of births, and even the king of gods couldn't undo what they'd arranged. Apollo once tried to cheat the Moirae on behalf of his friend Admetus. When the fates came to cut Admetus's thread, Apollo got them drunk and convinced them to allow a substitution. If someone else volunteered to die in Admetus's place, he could live. Admetus's wife, Alcestis, took the deal and died for him, though Heracles later brought her back from the underworld. Even so, this was the closest anyone ever came to bending the fates' rules, and it only worked because Apollo caught them in a moment of weakness, and because someone still had to die. The sisters appeared at crucial moments throughout mythology, usually at births. When a child was born, especially one destined for greatness or tragedy, the Moirae sometimes showed up to announce what would happen. They told Achilles' mother, Thetis, that her son would either live a long, unremarkable life or die young with eternal glory. His choice. But one of those two fates was certain. They appeared when Paris was born and predicted he would cause the destruction of Troy. These prophecies always came true, no matter how hard anyone tried to prevent them. Some philosophers and poets back then debated what the Moirae actually represented. Were they conscious beings making deliberate choices, or were they more like personifications of an abstract principle? The Greeks never fully settled that question, but they understood the practical reality. You could pray to Zeus for victory in battle, to Athena for wisdom, to Aphrodite for love. Those gods might help or might not, depending on their moods and politics. But the Moirae didn't take requests, and you couldn't do the little song and dance with things like sacrifices or temples. They just did their work, spinning and measuring and cutting, and the universe unfolded according to their design. This made them terrifying in a way that even the most powerful Olympians weren't. All you could do was live out whatever they'd woven into it, and hope that Atropos took her time before making the final cut. The next story is about Prometheus and his theft of fire. You see, Prometheus wasn't like the other Titans. When the war between the Titans and Olympians erupted, the same one we discussed a little bit ago, most of his kind sided with Cronus and fought against Zeus. But Prometheus had foresight. His name literally meant forethought, and he could see how things would play out. He joined Zeus's side, and his brother Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought, came with him. Their decision to back the Olympians might have saved them from being thrown into Tartarus with the rest of the Titans after the war ended. But it didn't mean Zeus trusted Prometheus. That would turn out to be wise, because Prometheus had his own ideas about how the world should work. After the Olympians won and established their rule, Zeus set about organizing the cosmos and distributing powers and privileges. The gods received their domains and their honors. Zeus kept the sky and supreme authority. Poseidon got the seas. Hades took the underworld. The other Olympians received their own spheres of influence. Like, for example, Athena got wisdom and warfare. Apollo claimed music and prophecy. Artemis took the hunt, and so on. Everyone divine was accounted for and rewarded. Humans, though, were an afterthought. They existed, but Zeus didn't particularly care about them. In his view, mortals were weak, temporary creatures who would live and die without affecting much of anything important. They didn't deserve special consideration or gifts. Let them survive on their own or not. I mean, what difference did it make to the gods? Prometheus saw things differently. He'd been given the task of creating animals and humans, along with his brother, Epimetheus. But Epimetheus, true to his name, didn't think ahead. He got excited distributing gifts to the animals and gave them everything good: fur for warmth, claws for defense, wings for escape, speed, strength, venom, shells, camouflage. By the time he got to humans, there was nothing left. Humans were naked, slow, weak, without natural weapons or armor. Effectively, they were helpless. Prometheus loved humans. Some stories said he'd literally shaped them from clay, forming them in the image of the gods. Whether that was true or not, he felt responsible for them and saw potential in them that Zeus didn't recognize. So he decided to help, even if it meant defying the king of the gods. Humans at that point were struggling just to survive. They huddled in caves, terrified of the dark and the cold, and of course, the predators that hunted them. They ate raw food and shivered through winters. They were dying at an alarming rate. What they needed, Prometheus realized, was fire. Fire would change everything. With it, humans could cook food, making it safer and easier to digest. They could stay warm through winter. They could forge tools and weapons, work metal, build civilizations, protect themselves. Fire was the key that would unlock human potential. But fire belonged to the gods. It burned in their workshops and palaces on Mount Olympus, and Zeus had no intention of sharing it with mortals. He'd specifically forbidden it. In Zeus's mind, fire was too powerful for humans. Give them that kind of tool, and who knows what they might accomplish. They might start thinking they were equals to the gods. Better to keep them in their place. Prometheus didn't agree. He made his choice and came up with a plan. He climbed Mount Olympus and made his way to Hephaestus's workshop. Hephaestus was the smith god, the craftsman of divine weapons and tools, and his forge burned with eternal flames. While Hephaestus was distracted, Prometheus stole a burning ember from that forge. But he couldn't just carry it openly. Someone would see. Instead, he hid the flame inside a hollow fennel stalk, a plant with a pithy interior that could hold a spark without burning up immediately. Then he descended from Olympus and brought the fire to humans. The gift transformed humanity overnight. They cooked their food and they warmed their homes and could survive in harsher climates. They began working with metals, copper, bronze, eventually iron, forging tools that let them shape the world around them. Agriculture became more sophisticated. Communities grew larger and more organized. Art and technology advanced when survival was no longer the only concern. Humans went from cowering in caves to building cities, all because of fire. Zeus found out, obviously. When he realized what Prometheus had done, his rage was absolute. Prometheus had been on Zeus's side during the war, had been trusted, and he'd repaid that trust by stealing from the gods and empowering mortals against explicit orders. Zeus couldn't let that stand. The punishment Zeus devised was cruel, even by the standards of Greek gods, who weren't exactly known for mercy in general. He had Prometheus dragged to the Caucasus Mountains, a remote and desolate range at what the Greeks considered the edge of the world. There, on a barren cliff face, Zeus had the Titan chained. Hephaestus himself forged the chains, the same god whose fire Prometheus had stolen, ironically enough. He created those chains in a way that nothing could break them, and he drove them through Prometheus's body, pinning him to the rock. But Zeus wasn't done. Death would have been too merciful, and besides, Prometheus was immortal. He couldn't die, so Zeus arranged for ongoing torture. Every day, he sent an eagle, or a vulture in some versions, to the mountain. The bird would land on Prometheus's chest and tear into his abdomen with its beak and talons. Then it would eat his liver, ripping out the organ while Prometheus screamed and bled. The liver here has a deeper meaning than just picking an organ at random, because ancient Greeks believed it was the seat of emotions and life force, making its consumption particularly agonizing. But Prometheus was a titan, and his body regenerated. Every night, while he hung there in the darkness and cold of the mountain, His liver grew back as the wounds healed, and every morning the eagle returned to tear him apart again. This went on for a long time. Prometheus hung there through all of it, suffering the same torture day after day. But Prometheus had foresight, remember? He knew secrets about the future, including one that Zeus desperately wanted to know. There was a prophecy that Zeus would one day be overthrown by a son, just as he'd overthrown Cronus, and Cronus had overthrown Uranus. Zeus was terrified of this happening, and he knew Prometheus could tell him which relationship would produce this dangerous child. Several times, Zeus sent messengers to the Caucasus, Hermes usually, offering to free Prometheus if he'd reveal the secret. But Prometheus refused. He'd endure the torture rather than help Zeus. Eventually, Heracles came along. This was the great hero, Zeus's mortal son, who was in the middle of completing his legendary labors. During his travels, Heracles passed through the Caucasus Mountains and found Prometheus chained there. It gets a bit muddy here, and I checked multiple versions of this tale. The exact circumstances varied depending on who told the story. In some versions, Zeus had softened slightly by this point and allowed Heracles to free the Titan as one of his heroic deeds. In others, Heracles acted on his own, moved by pity for Prometheus's suffering. Either way, Heracles shot the eagle out of the sky with one of his arrows, possibly dipped in the poisonous venom of the Hydra, making the kill certain. Then he broke the chains that held Prometheus. After however long it had been, Prometheus was finally free. There was a condition, though. Zeus's pride demanded that his punishment stand in some form, so Prometheus had to wear a ring made from his chains, with a piece of the Caucasus rock set into it. This way, technically, he was still bound to the mountain, and Zeus's decree remained in force. It was a token gesture, but it satisfied Zeus's need to save face. Prometheus eventually revealed the prophecy's details, and Zeus learned that any son born to the sea goddess Thetis was destined to be greater than his father. So Zeus made sure she married a mortal, Peleus, instead of taking her as his own lover. Their son turned out to be Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War. Dangerous, yes, but no threat to Zeus's throne. The whole thing showed something important about how the Greek gods were viewed. They were super powerful, but they weren't all-knowing or always right. Zeus had nearly unlimited strength and authority, but Prometheus, weaker, chained, tortured for years, still won in a sense. He'd given humanity fire and all the advancement that came with it, and Zeus couldn't take that back. Humans had the gift now, and they'd never give it up. And humans remembered. They honored Prometheus as a champion, a rebel who'd sacrificed himself for their benefit, and he became a symbol of standing up to tyranny. While we're on the topic of humans, let's talk about Pandora's box next. Zeus didn't forgive easily, and he definitely didn't forget. Prometheus had stolen fire and given it to humans, as we just covered. But punishing the Titan wasn't enough for Zeus. He wanted to punish humanity too, to make them regret ever accepting Prometheus's gift. So he came up with a plan. He called Hephaestus to him and gave the smith god a special assignment. Hephaestus was to create something that had never existed before, a woman. Up until this point in the mythos, humans were all male, born from the earth, or created by the Titans. And yes, I know that doesn't really make sense, because mortals like Heracles, for example, existed, who had a mother and all that. But remember, the mythos is really non-linear. So Hephaestus took soil and water and shaped them into a form, molding clay into limbs and features. He worked with the same skill he used when forging weapons for the gods, and when he finished, the figure looked perfect, lifelike but not yet alive. Zeus breathed life into the clay, and she opened her eyes. Then he summoned the other Olympians and told them to give her gifts. This was the part Zeus found fun. He'd make this creation so appealing, so desirable, that no one could refuse her. Each god contributed something. Athena taught her handicrafts and weaving, skills that would make her useful and accomplished. Aphrodite gave her devastating beauty, the kind that would make men lose their senses. Apollo taught her music. Hermes gave her persuasive speech and a cunning mind, the ability to manipulate and deceive. Demeter showed her how to tend gardens. Poseidon granted her a pearl necklace. Even Hera, who rarely showed generosity, gave her curiosity, a desire to know things, to explore, to discover secrets. They dressed her in fine clothes and adorned her with jewelry. When they finished, she was irresistible. Every gift made her more perfect, more fascinating. Zeus named her Pandora, which meant all gifted, because every god had contributed to her creation. She was a masterpiece, beautiful and talented and charming, and she just so happened to be a weapon. Zeus gave Pandora one more thing: a large jar. Some later retellings called it a box due to a mistranslation, and that's the version that stuck. But originally it was actually a jar, something called a pythos, the kind Greeks used for storing wine or oil or grain. This jar was sealed, and Zeus's instructions were crystal clear. Pandora must never open it. Under no circumstances should she break that seal. He didn't tell her what was inside. He just said, "Don't open it," handed it to her, and sent her on her way. Her destination was Earth, specifically the home of Epimetheus. He was Prometheus's brother, the titan of afterthought, the one who never planned ahead. Prometheus, at this time still chained to his rock in the Caucasus, had warned his brother about Zeus. "Don't accept any gifts from him," Prometheus had said. "Whatever Zeus offers, it's a trick." But when Pandora arrived at Epimetheus's door, he forgot every warning he'd ever received. How could he not? She was perfect, beautiful, intelligent, charming, skilled in arts and music and conversation. The loneliness he'd felt living by himself vanished the moment he saw her. Epimetheus's whole nature was about not thinking ahead, about acting on impulse and dealing with consequences later. Of course, he'd accept Pandora and welcome her into his home and his life. They married, and Pandora adapted to her new life, learning the routines of a household, spending her days with Epimetheus. But that jar sat in their home, sealed and mysterious, and Pandora couldn't stop thinking about it. Hera's gift of curiosity gnawed at her constantly. What was inside? Why had Zeus forbidden her from opening it? Was it treasure, secrets, something dangerous? She tried to resist, but the not knowing was torture. She started justifying it to herself. Maybe Zeus was testing her obedience and wouldn't actually mind if she took one quick look. She reckoned she could open it just a crack, just enough to peek inside, and then seal it again before anything happened. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. When Epimetheus was away, Pandora broke the seal and lifted the lid. Zeus had filled it with every terrible thing that could afflict humanity. The moment Pandora opened it, they all came pouring out in a dark rush. Sickness erupted from the jar. Diseases of every kind, viruses and infections and chronic illnesses that would plague humanity forever. Death came next. And I don't mean just the concept of death itself, but rather all the painful ways to die. War spilled out, bringing violence and conflict and the urge to destroy each other. Hatred followed, soaking into human hearts. Envy crawled out, making people resent each other's successes. Greed came next, turning contentment into endless wanting. Old age appeared, bringing deterioration and decay. Toil and hardship spread across the earth. Lies, madness, suffering, despair, the usual cocktail of bad stuff. Pandora tried to close the jar, slamming the lid back down, but it was too late. The evils had already escaped and were spreading everywhere, infecting humanity with miseries they'd never known before. But something remained inside the jar. When Pandora finally got the lid back on, one thing hadn't escaped yet. Elpis, which meant hope. Different interpretations existed for why hope stayed trapped. Some said it was because hope was fragile, so staying in the jar kept it safe. Others argued that hope was actually another evil, a false comfort that keeps people suffering through terrible situations instead of giving up, and Zeus trapped it there as a final cruelty, giving humanity just enough hope to keep going through all the other torments. The most common interpretation is simpler. Hope remained as a mercy, perhaps the only mercy in the whole scheme. The belief that things might get better gave them a reason to keep going, despite everything else, and find little pockets of joy amidst all the horrors. Pandora was devastated by what she'd done. The woman created to be perfect, gifted by all the gods, had brought ruin to humanity. Some versions of the story treated her sympathetically. She'd been set up to fail, after all. Zeus had given her curiosity specifically so she'd open the jar, and he'd forbidden her from opening it specifically so she'd want to. Other versions were harsher, blaming Pandora for her weakness and lack of self-control. She chose to disobey, and humanity paid the price. Although the ancient Greeks are by no means the only civilization or religion to frame stuff like this, and I'm sure you can think of at least one obvious example, this interpretation did fit into a larger Greek narrative about women being dangerous and untrustworthy, a pretty common theme that ran through a lot of their mythology. Either way, the result was the same. The world changed. Prometheus had given them fire and the ability to advance, to build a life free of struggle. Zeus, in response, gave them Pandora and her jar, filling their lives with suffering to balance out whatever progress they might make. The next tale is about Perseus and the Gorgon Medusa. Perseus was born into a situation that was already complicated and dangerous, the kind of mess that Greek gods specialized in creating. His mother was Danae, a princess of Argos and daughter of King Acrisius. His father was Zeus, who had a bad habit of getting mortal women pregnant and then leaving them to deal with the consequences. Acrisius had received a prophecy that his grandson would kill him, so he'd locked Danae in a bronze chamber underground. To prevent her from ever having children, Zeus got around this by transforming into golden rain and seeping through the chamber's ceiling. I really don't know the logistics of how this works, but just use your imagination, I guess. When Acrisius discovered that Danae had given birth to a son, he panicked. He couldn't just kill them outright. Murdering his own daughter and grandson would bring down the Furies' wrath, who punished crimes against the natural order like killing your family. So instead, he sealed both Danae and baby Perseus in a wooden chest and threw it into the sea, leaving their fate to the gods. The chest washed up on the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in. Perseus grew up there, raised by his mother and protected by Dictys, who treated them like family. Life was decent for a while. Perseus became strong and capable, trained in athletics and combat like any young man of his time. He didn't know his divine heritage initially, just that he and his mother were under Dictys' protection. The problem started when Polydectes, the king of Seriphos and Dictys' brother, decided he wanted Danae for himself. She wasn't interested, and Perseus made it clear his mum was off limits. Polydectes couldn't just force the issue while Perseus was around. The young man was too protective, too much of an obstacle. So Polydectes came up with a plan to get rid of him. The king announced he was getting married to someone else. A lie, but it gave him an excuse to demand wedding gifts from all the men of the island. Everyone was expected to contribute horses, which were valuable and prestigious. Perseus didn't have horses. He had nothing to offer, which was exactly what Polydectes wanted. When Perseus showed up empty-handed, Polydectes publicly humiliated him, calling him worthless and poor. Perseus, young and proud and stung by the insult, made a rash promise. He'd bring Polydectes any gift he wanted, anything at all, to prove his worth. Polydectes smiled and said he wanted the head of Medusa, the Gorgon. He might as well have asked Perseus to fly to the moon. Everyone knew what Medusa was, and everyone knew that seeking her out meant certain death. Medusa was one of 3 Gorgon sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa herself. The other 2 were immortal monsters, born that way, but Medusa had once been human. She'd been beautiful, actually, a priestess in Athena's temple. Poseidon had assaulted her in that temple, violating the sacred space, and Athena, furious that her temple had been defiled, punished Medusa for it. Yeah, the gods of Olympus are pretty awful if that wasn't clear already. The goddess transformed the priestess into a monster. Medusa's hair became a mass of living, venomous serpents that writhed and hissed constantly. Her face became so hideous that anyone who looked directly at it turned instantly to stone. Her hands became bronze claws, and some versions gave her wings, or said her lower body became serpentine. She and her sisters lived far to the west, in a desolate region beyond the known world. The area around their lair was a horrific sculpture garden of stone figures. Warriors, travelers, foolish heroes who tried to kill the Gorgons and failed. They stood frozen in their final moments, with expressions of terror on their petrified faces. Even birds that flew too close and looked down became stone and fell from the sky. Perseus accepted the challenge because he had no choice. Backing down would mean dishonor, and it would leave his mother vulnerable to Polydectes. But he had no idea how to actually accomplish this suicide mission. That's when the gods stepped in. Athena appeared to him first. She had her own grudge against Medusa. The Gorgon was technically her creation right, her punishment made flesh. Athena gave Perseus a polished bronze shield, bright as a mirror. She explained that he could never look directly at Medusa, but he could look at her reflection. The shield would show him where she was without turning him to stone. Hermes came next, representing Zeus's interest in keeping his son alive. The messenger god brought Perseus a pair of winged sandals that would let him fly, and an adamantine sickle sharp enough to cut through anything, even a Gorgon's neck. But Perseus still needed to find the Gorgons, and he needed protection from Medusa's sisters, who definitely tried to avenge her death. Hermes told him he needed 3 more items: a cap that would make him invisible, a special bag to carry Medusa's head, and information about where the Gorgons actually lived. These things could only be obtained from the Hesperides, nymphs who lived at the western edge of the world. But nobody knew where the Hesperides were except the Grey, 3 ancient sisters who shared 1 eye and 1 tooth between them. Perseus flew to the cave where the Grey lived. These withered crones were sisters to the Gorgons, born old and grey. They sat in the darkness, passing their single eye back and forth so each could take turns seeing. Perseus waited until one sister removed the eye to hand it to another, then snatched it out of the air. With their eye hostage, the Grey had no choice but to tell him how to find the Hesperides. The nymphs of the west gave him what he needed: a cap of invisibility taken from Hades' realm, and a kibisis, a special bag that could safely contain Medusa's head. They told him where to find the Gorgon's lair. Perseus put on the winged sandals and flew west, over lands he'd never seen, past the edges of the civilized world, until he reached the desolate place where the 3 sisters made their home. He arrived while they were sleeping, and Perseus crept through the garden of stone victims, careful not to make a sound that might wake the monsters. He could hear the serpents on their heads hissing and moving, even in sleep. He had to identify which one was Medusa. Her sisters were immortal, so killing them was pointless. I couldn't find exactly how he determined which of the three was Medusa. Maybe she somehow looked mortal compared to the other two. But anyways, however he determined it, he approached her while looking only at her reflection in his polished shield. The reflection showed him everything in reverse. He could see Medusa's face, distorted and terrible even in the mirror, the snakes writhing on her head. He could see where her neck was vulnerable. Moving carefully, watching only the shield, he raised the adamantine sickle and swung. The blade cut clean through. Medusa's head separated from her body, and at that moment, two additional beings emerged from her severed neck. Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword, and Pegasus, the winged horse. Both were Poseidon's offspring, conceived when he'd assaulted Medusa back when she was human. They'd been gestating inside her all this time, and now they sprang fully formed from her blood. Medusa's sisters woke immediately, shrieking in rage. They saw their sister's headless body and went berserk, searching for the killer. But Perseus had already grabbed Medusa's head and shoved it into the kibbasis, careful never to look at it directly. He put on Hades' cap of invisibility, and even though the Gorgon's sisters could sense him nearby, they couldn't see him to attack. He activated the winged sandals and flew away while they screamed their fury. The head retained its power even after death. Drops of blood fell from the bag as Perseus flew, and where they hit the ground in the Libyan desert, they became venomous snakes. Some other legends say this was the origin of all the serpents in North Africa. On his way back to Seriphos, he had other adventures. He'd encounter Atlas and turn the Titan to stone, creating the Atlas Mountains. He'd save Andromeda from a sea monster using Medusa's head and marry her. But eventually, he made it home, still carrying Medusa's head in its bag. He found that Polydectes had spent the time trying to force Danae to marry him. She'd taken refuge in a temple with Dictys protecting her, but Polydectes was losing patience. Perseus walked into the king's hall, where Polydectes was feasting with his supporters. They mocked Perseus, not believing he'd actually completed the impossible task. Perseus told them he'd brought the gift, as promised. He pulled Medusa's head from the bag, holding it up while carefully looking away. Everyone in the hall who saw the Gorgon's face turned instantly to stone. Polydectes, his cronies, all of them frozen mid-laugh, transformed into statues. Dictys became king of Seriphos after that, and he deserved it. He'd been kind when kindness wasn't required. Perseus gave Medusa's head to Athena, who mounted it on her aegis, the shield or breastplate she wore into battle. The Gorgon's face became one of Athena's symbols. Perseus kept the other gifts for a while, the sandals, the cap, the sickle, but eventually returned them to the gods who'd lent them. The prophecy about Acrisius eventually came true, the way prophecies always did. Years later, Perseus was competing in athletic games and threw a discus that went off course, striking and killing an old man in the crowd. That man turned out to be Acrisius, who'd been traveling under a false name. You couldn't escape fate, even when you locked your daughter in a bronze chamber and threw your grandson into the sea. The Moirae made sure of that. Medusa's story became one of the most famous monster-slaying tales in Greek mythology. It's a shame, I think, that most versions are really sanitized, because you always see Perseus as the clever hero who used his wits and divine gifts to defeat an unbeatable, horrific enemy. But it's really worth remembering Medusa had been a victim first, punished for the terrible act that Poseidon committed, transformed into a monster, and then killed for being that monster. Whether the ancient Greeks intended it or not, little did they know how on the nose it was, for the way victims are still treated, even all these years and advancements later. But for the last myth today, we're talking about the abduction of Persephone. Persephone grew up on Olympus and in the mortal world, splitting her time between divine and earthly realms. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and Zeus, king of the gods. Demeter raised her carefully, keeping her close and sheltered. As Persephone matured, her beauty became remarkable even among immortals. She had her mother's warmth and connection to growing things, and flowers bloomed more vibrantly when she walked past them. Hades rarely left his kingdom. The lord of the underworld had drawn that realm when he and his brothers divided the cosmos after defeating the Titans, and he'd accepted his lot. His domain was vast. All the dead came to him eventually, and the riches buried in the earth belonged to him as well. But it was lonely. The underworld was grey and silent, populated by shades and memories. Hades had power and wealth, yet he had no companion, no one to share his eternal existence. When he did venture to the surface world, he noticed Persephone. Where his world was dark and still, she embodied light and growth. Where he ruled over endings, she represented springtime and beginnings. He became obsessed. He wanted her in his realm, wanted that brightness in the depths. But he knew Demeter would never agree to let her daughter marry the god of the dead and live in darkness forever. So Hades went to Zeus instead. As king of the gods and Persephone's father, Zeus had the authority to arrange her marriage. Zeus agreed to the marriage without consulting Demeter or Persephone. Whether he thought Demeter would come around eventually, or whether he simply didn't care about her objections, he gave Hades permission to take Persephone as his wife. The abduction happened while Persephone was in a meadow in Nysa, though some versions place it in Sicily or near Eleusis. She'd gone there with the Oceanids, nymphs who served as her companions and friends. They were gathering flowers, enjoying the sunshine and each other's company. The meadow was full of blooms, and Persephone moved among them, collecting the most beautiful specimens. Then she saw a narcissus unlike any flower that had ever grown, with 100 blooms sprouting from a single root. The scent was intoxicating, sweet enough to make heaven and earth and sea smile, according to the Homeric hymn. The flower was so extraordinary that Persephone had to have it. She reached out both hands to pluck it. The moment she touched the stem, the earth split open. A chasm opened right in front of her, and from that darkness came Hades in his chariot pulled by immortal horses. He grabbed Persephone, lifted her into the chariot, and drove back down into the earth. The Oceanids heard her cries, but could do nothing. The earth sealed itself as if nothing had happened, leaving only the scattered flowers she'd dropped. The whole thing had been arranged. Zeus had helped plan it. And Gaia had grown that special narcissus as bait, knowing Persephone wouldn't be able to resist it. The abduction was a conspiracy between gods. Again, just such terrible beings. Demeter heard her daughters scream from far away. She came running, but by the time she reached the meadow, there was no sign of Persephone. Demeter questioned the nymphs desperately, but they hadn't seen who took her. They'd only heard the screams. A mother's grief overtook her as Demeter searched everywhere for Persephone. She wandered the earth for 9 days and 9 nights without sleeping, eating, or bathing. On the 10th day, Hecate approached her. The goddess of witchcraft and crossroads had heard Persephone's cries, but hadn't seen the abduction either. Together, Demeter and Hecate went to Helios, the sun god who saw everything that happened during daylight. Helios had watched the whole thing unfold. He told Demeter the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to be his wife and queen of the underworld. Zeus had approved the marriage. Her daughter was gone, and there was nothing Demeter could do about it because Zeus had sanctioned it. Helios tried to soften the blow by pointing out that Hades was a powerful god, not an unworthy match. But his words didn't comfort her. Demeter didn't care about Hades' status or wealth. Her daughter had been stolen into the land of the dead. Demeter, feeling betrayed, refused to return to the gods and wandered among mortals in disguise. She came to Eleusis, where the royal family took her in, not knowing who she was. She became nurse to the queen's infant son, Demophon, and tried to make him deathless, anointing him with ambrosia and placing him in the hearth fire at night. When the queen saw it, she cried out in terror, and the interruption ended Demeter's attempt. Demeter, furious at the mortal misunderstanding, revealed her true form. But the real devastation was what happened to the earth itself. Demeter had dominion over crops and harvests, over everything that grew from the soil. In her grief and fury, she withdrew her blessing. Nothing would grow anymore. The grain refused to sprout, and trees stopped bearing fruit. Crops that were already growing withered and died in the fields. Animals began to starve, and soon humans faced the same fate. The mortals made sacrifices to the gods, begging for relief, but nothing changed. The other Olympians tried to convince Demeter to restore the harvest, offering her gifts and honors, but she refused them all. She made her position clear. The earth would remain barren until Persephone was returned to her. Zeus finally realized he had to intervene. He sent Hermes to the underworld with a command to release Persephone. In the underworld, Persephone had been living as Hades' wife and reluctant queen. Different versions of the myth portrayed this period differently. Some said she remained miserable and defiant the entire time, refusing to eat or accept her situation. Others suggested that Hades treated her well, that he genuinely loved her in his way, and that she'd begun to adjust to her new role. The underworld was strange and dark, populated by the shades of the dead, but it had its own kind of grandeur. When Hermes arrived with Zeus's command, Hades agreed to let her go. He couldn't directly defy Zeus, but he also wasn't going to simply lose his wife without taking precautions. Before Persephone left, he gave her pomegranate seeds. This is again where it gets a little mixed up. In one story, he offered them openly, and she ate them willingly. Others claimed he secretly slipped them into her mouth or tricked her into eating them. The number varied too, depending on whether it's the Homer or Ovid version of the story. The important bit here is that in the ancient world, eating food in the underworld created a permanent bond to that realm. It was a rule older than the Olympians, one of those fundamental laws built into the cosmos. Anyone who consumed food from the land of the dead could never fully leave it. The seeds were small, seemingly insignificant, but they chained Persephone to the underworld, just as surely as if Hades had locked her in adamantine shackles. Hermes brought Persephone back to the surface. The reunion between mother and daughter was joyful at first. Demeter was ecstatic, ready to restore the earth's fertility now that Persephone had returned. Then she asked if her daughter had eaten anything while in the underworld. Persephone admitted she'd eaten the pomegranate seeds. Demeter's joy curdled immediately into despair and fury. Those seeds meant Persephone was bound to Hades, required to return to him. The rule couldn't be broken, not even by Zeus. Demeter had gotten her daughter back only to learn she'd have to give her up again. Zeus proposed a compromise. For each pomegranate seed Persephone had eaten, she would spend 1 month of the year in the underworld with Hades. The rest of the year, she could live on the surface with her mother. So she ended up spending around 1/3 of the year down in the underworld with Hades, and the remainder up above with her mother. Demeter accepted because she had no other choice, but she made it clear that her mood would reflect Persephone's presence or absence. This became the mythological explanation for the seasons. When Persephone descended to the underworld to spend her time with Hades, Demeter grieved. Her sorrow killed the growing things, bringing autumn and winter. The earth became cold and barren, crops died, and nothing would grow. When Persephone returned in the spring, Demeter's joy brought life back to the world. Flowers bloomed, trees budded, crops sprouted. Summer followed spring, warm and abundant, until it was time for Persephone to descend again. Another fun fact that is less talked about, though, is that this is the myth that shaped one of the most important religious institutions in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries. These were secret rites held annually at Eleusis, the city where Demeter had stayed during her searching. The Mysteries were initiation ceremonies that promised initiates a better fate after death. Only those who'd been initiated knew exactly what happened during the rituals, and they kept those secrets so well that even now we don't know all the details. What we do know is that the Mysteries reenacted Demeter's grief and Persephone's return. They involved fasting, sacred dramas, and revelation of holy objects. Initiates experienced something that fundamentally changed their understanding of death and the afterlife. The Mysteries were incredibly popular and lasted for nearly 2,000 years, drawing participants from across the Mediterranean world. Everyone from Plato to Roman emperors underwent initiation. The core message seemed to involve accepting the cycle of death and rebirth. Everyone would eventually descend to Hades' realm when they died. But the Mysteries suggested that there was transformation, continuation, something beyond the darkness. Over time, Persephone grew into her role as queen of the underworld. When Orpheus descended to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice, he had to petition both Hades and Persephone, and some versions said it was Persephone whose heart was moved by his music. When Heracles came to capture Cerberus as one of his labors, Persephone was there beside her husband. She embodied duality, life and death, innocence and sovereignty, victim and powerful queen. I really enjoy this myth. It's just such a good example of what people's minds can think up when trying to explain the world and events around them. I do often wonder if future generations, many centuries later, will think of you and I in this same way, when they wonder why we'd think up things like aliens and other stuff to explain the as of yet unknown. But before I get too deep and uselessly introspective, this is where we'll end tonight's stories. I hope you enjoyed these, and let me know down in the comments if you want more of this. There's still so many myths and legends to talk about. But until next time, stay safe out there, friends, and sweet dreams.